Hello and welcome to Unit 5 of Week 2. This unit focuses on billing customer projects. Here you see the end-to-end process how project invoices are created in Business by Design. It starts here in the lower left corner with expenses being recorded to a project. These expenses could be a time recording, an expense recording, a supplier invoice, or a material consumption. The system tries to determine, based on certain assignment rules, which sales order item the expense belongs to. We will talk about this later in more detail, but for each expense it is necessary that it is assigned to both a project task and a sales order item. The not invoiced time and expenses is a work list for the project manager where he or she can work on the expenses that have not been invoiced. For example, it is possible to write off certain expenses because you do not want them to be invoiced at all. Or you could block certain items because you do not want to invoice them at this point in time. And the third option is to enter a sales order item when the system rules couldn't determine a sales order item. Or you can manually adjust the sales order item if you do not agree with the system default. Then it comes to the actual invoicing and the three supported options. You see that here. Option 1 is the manual project invoice request. The project manager or alternatively a back office resource manually puts together the invoice in a guided activity. Option 2 is the automatic project invoice request. In this case, the user triggers that the system puts together the invoice request automatically and, once done, allows to manually adjust it if needed. Option 1 and 2 are often used for customer projects built on a time and material basis. The third option is the invoice schedule. The system automatically generates a customer invoice based on the dates in the invoice schedule, which has been maintained in the sales order item. All three options can be used for time and material as well as fixed price projects or a mixture of both. After the project invoice request has been created, it can be checked and, if necessary, can be adjusted. After release, it becomes a customer project invoice request. The release of the project invoice request can be automated via a setting in the sales order. With the next scheduled invoice run, the system creates a customer invoice. If any down payments exist for the project, they will be considered in the customer invoice. Before we look into the actual invoicing process, I'd like to take a step back and talk a little about the challenges that exist for project invoicing and how the system can help you to overcome them. As mentioned a couple of times, there's not one way to deal with customer projects, and this is also the case when it comes to the invoicing of projects. One challenge is that the structure of the involved business objects, that means the sales order, the project, and the customer invoice, might deviate. So the cardinality between the objects can be one-to-one, but this is not necessarily the case. It could also be the case that the sales order is structured by product. Here you see consultancy, junior and senior consultancy, and travel costs, and that the project is structured by phases. And finally, the customer asked that the invoices should be structured by employee. Invoicing is very easy when all these three structures that you see here are identical. That means the cardinality is one-to-one. But if this is not the case, Business by Design can help with so-called assignment rules. And if still necessary, you can always do manual adjustments and override what the system suggests. Let me start with some background why these assignment rules are helpful in cases where the cardinality is not one-to-one between sales order items and projects. You need to assign expenses to both project tasks and sales order items. For fixed price projects, The reason is to connect the costs of goods sold coming from the project to the revenues coming from the sales order, and therefore to allow profit analysis. On top of this, for time and material projects, you need to get the prices from the sales order item for invoicing. So the quantity comes from the project confirmation, and this quantity is then valuated with the price from the sales order. Here we see 3 examples. As mentioned before, in cases of one-to-one relationships between project task and sales orders, which we can see on the left, the system can do the assignment very easily by itself. But in cases where one project task or a whole subtree or the entire project is assigned to multiple sales order items, then the system needs additional information to automate the assignment. Manual or rule-based assignment is also necessary in cases where a project task is not assigned to a sales order item at all. Now let's talk about the assignment rules. To help with the sales order item determination, the solution was designed in a way that it makes suggestions based on assignment rules. These assignment rules are automatically executed when the document is posted on a customer project task. Hereby, the expense document could be a time or expense recording, a supplier invoice, or a material consumption, as mentioned before. Here in the table, you see characteristics such as the project task, the source, the employee and service, or the material that can be used to tell the system which sales order item should be assigned. The good thing is that the system generates most of these assignment rules automatically. So let's look at this example. In this example, you see that all expense reports, wherever they are posted into the project, should be invoiced using the sales order item 30. Whereas time recordings from Tonya Gardner should be invoiced with sales order item 10 and get the price from item 10. Whereas time recordings from Peter Sellers should use the sales order item 20. And last but not least, all training efforts should be invoiced via sales order item 40. What is also important is the sequence, which you see here on the left. The system really works by the sequence, and for example, if Tonya Gardner would record training effort, it would still be the item 10 because she has the higher sequence. If you want training to make sure that this is always ending on 40, you would just move it up in the sequence and then it would be considered properly. Okay, with that we move on and now have a look at the not invoiced time and expenses. After project expenses have been processed by the assignment rule engine, they show up in the work center view, not invoiced time and expenses. I will show this in the demo. This view allows project managers to change incorrectly determined sales order items or to manually enter sales order items if the automatic determination was not possible. You can also write off quantities. This would mean that you only have the costs on the project, but you do not intend to bill it. Or you can block it. Blocking means that with the next invoice, it would not be considered, but after you remove the blocking, it is still there. That's the difference to the write-off. Okay, one more important topic here. Dependent on the type or the source, sometimes the amount is leading and sometimes the quantity is leading. So for example, for time recordings, the project manager would always work on the quantity. He or she could change the hours of the recording, whereas for expenses, for example, an expense report, they would work on the amounts. Now we come to the actual preparation of the customer invoice. In this example, I decided to go with the manual project invoice request, which is a guided activity that allows the project manager to define the invoice structure. For example, that the invoice is structured by consultant, as you can see here. It is also possible to once more adjust the assignment of times and expenses to sales order items, or to write off or defer certain times and expenses. But project invoicing can also be automated, and one way to do so is via invoice schedules in the sales order. In the invoice schedule of the sales order, you can either enter dedicated invoice dates, or you can also generate periodic invoice dates, for example, that invoices are sent each month. A third option is to link the invoice date in the invoice schedule to a project milestone. For fixed price projects, you enter a date, per date, an amount or a percentage of the overall amount. For time and material projects, you only maintain the dates. The amounts are based on the actual project confirmations. With that, I would like to go to the system and show a short demo. One way to trigger invoices is the invoice schedule. We learned this and we will have a look at this later. Another way would be to manually trigger it. And one trigger could be reporting. So for example, I have here a tile on my desktop that tells me that I have quite a high amount of inventory on my projects. That means inventory is the quantities, the recorded times and expenses multiplied with the prices of the sales order. So we have 28,000 here, and because this is above a certain threshold, which I have set personally, it's marked as red. I go in to figure out which projects have the highest inventory. In my responsibility, I have two projects, the CPSO6 and the CPSO13. Definitely the one with the higher inventory is the CPSO6, so that's the one I would like to start and invoice. But before going to the invoice, I go to the not yet invoiced time and expenses. I can find that in the Work Center Project Management and in the view not invoiced time and expenses. So what I see here are my projects. Most of them have been invoiced. Only for two of them there was still inventory left. That was CPSO6 and 13. And I go into the edit time and expenses. So what can I see here? First, I see all the expenses that have been recorded on my project. The system helps me to sort them or group them, and I could do that, for example, by employee to see who worked on my project. So it was Charlie West, John Thompson, Peter Sellers, and probably Tonya Gardner. Yes, here. Another way to group it could be by source, that I see, did I have time recordings, expense reports, did I have material consumptions? So here, that's just another way to look at it. So we see we have expense reports, 10, and we have time recordings on it. What helps me too is I could start and look for all these expenses. Did the rules work good enough and find the sales order item? And yes, this is the case. So all the time confirmations were done to the project, but the rules helped me to automatically determine always a sales order item. What I can do, I can block certain items, maybe because there's a dispute. The customer told me that these 8 hours that John Thompson reported, he does not want to pay for it. Before this is clarified, I want to block it so it's not showing up in an invoice. Or I could even go in and write it off. And then that means I could say, I would go here, enter 8 hours, then these 8 hours would be written off. I still have the expenses on the project because John Thompson actually worked on the project, but I will never have revenues for it because it will not be invoiced. With this, I save. And the next thing I would like to show are the assignment rules. So we go to View Assignment Rules. These assignment rules are mainly generated by the system automatically. So for example, the first entry, because in the sales order there was an expense item in it, it said, okay, all expenses in the project should be invoiced via that expense item. Others could be found because we linked certain items with certain parts of the project, so that could also be found. So the system really helps to generate the rules, but you can easily change them, add new rows, or change the sequence of it. So with that, we go to the actual invoicing. We have learned that there are three options: the manual, the automatic, or the invoice schedule. So in my case, I decide I want to go with the manual invoice request. It is a guided activity. On the first screen, I see the project and the sales order I write the invoice for. An important field is the time frame. So I could say, no restriction, everything on the project should be invoiced. Another aspect could be that you only want to invoice the last month. Time recordings that happened already in this month should not be considered. So here you can just set a time frame that should be considered. In my case, I want no restrictions. Everything on the project should be invoiced. On this next step, you would probably not change anything. You have information on the customer, like the payment terms. And then it comes to the definition: what structure do you want the invoice to have? So you could say you want it to look like the sales order, or you want to structure it by employee, or just manually put it together. In my case, I want to structure it by employee, and that's what you see here. You see a line item for Peter Sellers. You see one for John Thompson, for Charlie West. For Tonya Gardner, we have two, because there's one for consultancy for her work and one for travel lodging. Because there were some disputes with regard to the travel lodging, I will take this out. So I delete that item here. I could, again, manually adjust it and add here additional positions, but this is not, I don't want to do so at this point. So I move on. The next level is we want to assign the expenses to the items in the invoice, and the system can do this automatically for us. You see now all the assignments have been done. What is very helpful here is to again look at the expenses from different angles. You could say you want to summarize it by employee, what you see here. So Tonya Gardner in this invoice will have 31 hours recorded, Peter Sellers 4, John Thompson 47, Charlie West 4. But you can also say you want to look at it from a source point of view, so that you see how much expenses do you want to invoice, which is $1,291 and how many hours overall. Or you can say you want to look at it from a time perspective by calendar. Which calendar weeks are you invoicing? So we have effort in calendar week 6 and 8. So very easily you have here multiple ways to look at it. And you see down here for all of these items, you again have the possibility to change things. On the one hand side, you see for John Thompson, some of the his services that he performed are blocked. That's what we did in the work center view, not invoice time and expenses. I could change this here. I could also change other expenses here by taking them out or writing them off. So overall, I'm fine with it. I do not expect to do any changes here. So I go to the next step. Here, I review it one more time. I see again the quantities. I see the prices that have been picked from the sales orders, which could be adjusted. Normally you wouldn't do that, but it's a possibility that you could change the price here or give additional discounts. What is a very common aspect here is you can have an itemized list, because the customer will get an invoice by person, as we intend to do, but maybe you want as an attachment really a detailed list with all the recordings, all the time recordings for the customer to review it. You could do this as a CSV file or as a PDF. In my case, I plan to do it as a CSV file. So I say I want to have it structured by employee, and I want to create a CSV file. And the CSV file is now attached as to the invoice and will be sent together with the invoice to the customer and gives a detailed look at what has been done. So with that, we go have a final check and could finish it, and then the invoice will be sent to the customer. So that was the first part I wanted to show. Another aspect I wanted to show is to have a look at the sales order and the invoice schedule in the sales order. For this, we go to the sales orders and to the view sales orders. In here, I have prepared a view, and I want to show you the sales order 3201, and we immediately go to the items, item details. In the item details, there is a view pricing and invoicing, and in that you have the invoice schedule. And this schedule shows you that for that particular sales order, we have 2 dates. One is in the past, on the 16th of February. We invoiced already 9,000, so the status is invoiced. There's another one on the 23rd of March. 90% of the overall fixed price should be billed at that date, which is still open. The approach we choose here is we link these dates with milestones in the project. So if the project schedule changes because there's a delay, the invoice date will also change accordingly. Other ways to do an invoice schedule would be to add items manually, or via edit invoicing timeframe, you can do it periodically. For example, say every month, every week, every quarter, an invoice should be sent. With that, I'm at the end of the demo and would like to come to the recap. Let me recap. I talked about the challenges that the sales order structure, the project structure, and the invoice structure can deviate. We learned which project expenses are relevant for project invoicing and how assignment rules can help to determine the correct sales order item. We also learned about the different ways to trigger project invoice requests, which are manual and automatic project invoice requests, as well as invoice schedule. Thank you very much for watching Unit 5 of Week 2, and I hope to see you again for the last Unit 6.